mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is the 5th webinar we've held, and the hypothetical thought starter theme is barriers to implementation of connected automated vehicles. My name is Jerome Karslake. I'm just getting the slide up now. There you go. So that's me. For those of you who don't know, my name is, I manage and chair the Policy and Risk Group for the Australian New Zealand Drivers Vehicle Initiative, and I look after the National Road Safety Partnership Program, and I have the pleasure of facilitating today's webinar. We have an exciting session ahead. We have 5 incredible panelists, and I can tell you we have a very diverse group who know their subject matter very well. Before we dive into this, though, I have a bit of housekeeping we're going to go through, and because we want to make this as interactive as possible, and we really want to hear from you, the audience, as we go through it all. So, the vision, for those of you who don't know, is to accelerate the safe and successful introduction of driverless vehicles onto Australian and New Zealand roads. That's what ADVI's vision is. Our panelists today, we may have 1 or 2 that will be joining us through the presentation, but our first one we have is Anna Sawyer. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you, Jerome. Hello, everyone.
And Anna is the Manager for Road Safety at WA's RAC. Our next panelist is Dixon Lowe, Principal Technology Leader for Future Transport Technology here at ARB. Welcome, Dixon.
Thanks, John. Hello, everybody.
Catherine Tay, Managing Director of Future Eye. Are you online, Catherine?
She'll be with us in 1.
There we go.
Oh, here.
Our other person is just waiting to see if Catherine, you coming online?
Yes, I am. Hi.
Welcome, Catherine. Our other panelist coming on board, and he's just coming out of an aeroplane at any moment. I think there's some delays, is Glenn Keys. Glenn Keys is co-founder and co-executive chairman of Aspen Medical. He's also on the board of the National Disability Insurance Agency, and he's been awarded the 2015 ACT Australian of the Year. And he also sits on as chair of the Canberra Business Chamber. He has a range of other things and a fantastic person coming in from the disability and the business side of things. So we have a fantastic 5 panelists today. Thank you all. Housekeeping for today, we have 60 minutes. We have probably a bit of a presentation at the beginning, and then we're going to look at, say, at least 40 minutes worth of discussion. It may run over for, say, 15 minutes if discussion goes really well, and the recording of this will be available afterwards for those who have to leave early. I do apologise if you do. So, questions. If you have not been part of our webinars at all in the past, please take the time, throw them into the question box here. We want to make this as interactive as possible. We have some questions that we'll be theming through it all and really drawing together to get your thoughts as it goes in. We have some key themes which we'll be touching on in a moment. So let's really dive into how we're setting this up and looking at a bit of a context. For those of you that know, our 5 panelists have had a view of 2 futures. What they have is a future where mobility and technology has been given free rein, come again and is commonplace, and we did not achieve the ideal mobility future, but rather we have a rather dystopian one. So picture Blade Runner, Total Recall, Fifth Element. These are sort of cities which have been designed for for vehicles, I should say, not people. And this is a world which our panelists have had the unfortunate pleasure of glimpsing, and now they come back in their current role. But they've also had a chance to have a view of another utopian future. In this future, looking at around 2032, level 4, where connected autonomous vehicles operate in autonomous mode in defined locations, with the driver still behind the wheel, ready to take back control as required. Taxi boxes are operational on a limited basis, with autonomous high-occupancy vehicles integrated with mass public transport and lone drones driving around the place as well. We have the role and function of cities has changed dramatically, and Australia is accessible in all areas, including the regional areas. Mobility and connectivity is not constrained by state boundaries, and our cities are for people. They're not choked by vehicle. So, is this future plausible, or are we doomed to dystopia? Are we going to actually overcome any of the right barriers? And our panelists really are going to either disagree, put out different alternatives, or discuss how we've actually overcome them all. So, our approach. First thing we're going to do is dive in, and you can hear a little bit around the social license to operate. And hopefully that can take us away from this dystopic future, and you want to understand why that is important. We're going to have another brief touch on the ethical framework. Now, then what we're going to do is really dive in, launch a poll to you, our audience, and really get your thoughts as to what you think are some of the key issues. And we then have 3 themes to base our discussion around, which is safety, fairness, and control. So over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Jerome. So social license, why is that important to talk about now? Well, really it's to equip us for the what I think is going to be an excellent debate. Social license, if we think of that in this context, is the sort of thing that could help us understand how we manage to either stay in step with societal expectations as we move to our utopian future, or how we charged ahead and did not take into consideration the needs of society in our dystopian future. Thinking about social license, the question I put to you is, why are some risks likely to kill or harm but have very little public interest? And conversely, why do other risks that have no likely impact have significant public concern attached to them? And this is very relevant to our discussion today. It's to do with, let's talk about how we think of risk. There's a risk equation, and the risk equation expands on our traditional thinking about risk. Traditionally, we think about consequence, likelihood, and we call that hazard in social license. And there's a second type of risk, and interestingly, the two are not well correlated, which is to say that outrage, societal perceptions of risk, do not necessarily match the technical risk or the hazard that's present. What's interesting for us as we think about this and as we observe some of the debates around connected automated vehicles is that talking about the benefits or trying to overpower people's perceptions of risk by telling them that actually this will be better, or that the risks that they think are significant are actually not significant, can actually make things worse and can cause society to disengage or even polarize against the change you're trying to introduce. And for us, thinking about connected automated vehicles. So people that disagree with you and you argue with them, it's a bit like a personal relationship, I'll put it that way. If you find yourself in your life having an argument with somebody that's emotionally very upset with you because of their perception of what you've done, arguing with them about the facts, if you've been in that position, is not the best way to start the conversation. So let's move on to thinking about those two types of risk. Thanks, Jerome. Just on to the next slide, thanks.
Press click on the slide here. There you go.
Yep. So as we move through the debate, it'll be useful for us to keep in mind that there are our traditional thinking about risk, which is hazard, which is the expert assessment of the risk. And those are the well-informed, and I suspect almost the complete majority of everybody on this call, and then the public assessment of risk. A good example would be that of control. Now, if people are facing a situation that they feel they have little choice in or control, their perception of risk is much greater than it otherwise would be. So that's an example of one of the psychological drivers of outrage risk. What's embedded in all of this is the importance of being able to address the outrage risk before you can address the technical risk, the hazard risk. So I'll leave those thoughts with you just to bear in mind as we move through the discussion.
It's fantastic seeds for thought to move us forward. So I wonder how many people in our audience have thought of it through that lens. Next, I'd like to hand over to Anna, who's just going to touch on briefly around the ethical side of things. Anna.
Thank you, Jerome. I think the ethics of AVs has been talked about a lot, and the reason why I'd like to run you through the original trolley problem and then 3 scenarios for you today is really to think about that human drivers can be forgiven for making an instinctive but nonetheless bad split-second decision, but programmers and designers of automated vehicles don't have that luxury since they do have the time to get it right. And so when we look at ethical frameworks, it really means that we need to think about the guiding principles that will have to have a predetermined and programmed framework. And so what are some of these good or bad or right or wrong ways that these vehicles can be deployed And the first one is really the original trolley problem. So a runaway trolley rushes towards 5 people standing on a track and it's going to kill them all. But fortunately, there's a switch and it will allow you to divert the track to another. But you find that there's one person standing on that track. So what do? Do you flick the switch and say 5 but kill 1? Or do you do nothing and watch 5 people be killed? And so this is the original trolley problem that was set out by Philippa Foot. So let's have a look at some different scenarios involving what might happen with an AV. So when we program, say, an AV with a primary aim of improving safety for all road users. Now, that's good in principle, but a vehicle, we have to program it to cause less harm. And so that's one way that we can program and promote safety, is to create less harm. So if we think that that's a good way of programming it, let's have a look at the scenario, which is you have 2 motorcyclists in front of you. One is doing all the right things, obeying road rules, wearing their helmet, wearing all the protective gear. And you've seen another motorcyclist. Now, this motorcyclist has swerved in and out of lanes way before it's come in front of you, but this rider is wearing no protective gear. Now, the AV is about to crash. If we have it programmed so that it causes less harm, the only safe option is then for the AV to strike the motorcyclist wearing protective gear, because this is going to cause the least amount of harm. And so if we allow the vehicle to cause the least amount of harm in this case, then the person that is doing all the right things will have to be injured. So I'll leave you with that and we'll quickly move on to the next scenario. So how about if we were to program a vehicle to minimize casualties? Now, so what happens in a crash involving yourself and your family in your car when you're about to collide with a bus full of school children? So if we were to program the vehicle to cause the least amount of harm, in this scenario, your vehicle will certainly sacrifice you and your family for the sake of a greater number of lives saved. And the final scenario then, Jerome, is really the values-based decision-making. Do we as humans truly believe that everyone is equal, and do we value certain individuals over others? And so this is a scenario where the outcome is the same. One person is likely to be harmed where one is saved. There isn't a greater number or anything like that. So in this scenario with a younger person and an older person, would it make any difference should this boy be a delinquent with a long criminal record, or if the older woman was a specialist surgeon who was one of a handful of people in the world who was able to undertake specialist surgery? Now, would it make a difference if the woman had terminal cancer and had only several months to live? Should this affect the decision-making framework in any way? The concern with connected vehicles is that the rise of networked data and connected vehicles means that it's probably plausible that the AV will know who you are. If you have a Google Home and you get in a Google smart car and you've got a Google smartphone, then it will know who you are, where you live, your social media accounts, your Google searches, your smartphone usage, online purchases, well before it makes that decision to hit you or the other person. So I'm going to leave it there, but that's a really quick summary of some of the unintended consequences of programming right or wrong decisions or decision-making frameworks, decision-making choices in an automated and connected vehicle.
Fantastic job, Anna. And I know that topic can go on. I've seen a whole day of conference touching on just that element. So it's very a top issue, and already got a question here from Belinda, which I'll just touch on in a tick. But what we have first of all is we have a bit of a poll I'd just like to launch, and we just opened it out, and it's really just saying, what do you think among the audience are the key sort of issues? We've only got 5 options we can do, so technology is limited here for our choices. But what are your thoughts among the audience? We'll have this open for about 10 seconds before we move on. At the moment, we're collecting the responses. I'll give another. All right, I'll just close it off. We've got 40, 50%. Just about got everyone. All right, shall I close it off now? Okay. So what we have is we're going to share this now. About 47% of people believe safety, 35% believe it's control, 16% believe fairness, 32% is insurance, and 6% is others. So we'll be really keen to hear from the others as to what that encompasses. So I think we've got a pretty good flow in how we've mapped out and planned out this sort of session. All right, let's go through now. So our safety theme. As we've already got a question here from Belinda, we just touched on the trolley car. I'll put this straight out to everyone before we dive into it. So the trolley problem, does this just encourage pedestrians to move everywhere in packs so they know, sorry about that, so they know the bigger group? So will they act as a bit of a blockage to traffic, and is that your first barrier in regards to congestion? What's your thoughts, Dixon?
Well, that's a very good, interesting discussion, because currently, in terms of what we can see and what we know with the programming or the algorithm, which Anna touched on, is that in order to ensure safety, the vehicle at first point will come to a slowdown or to a halt whenever it detects an object. And then the system is then smart enough to whether or not that object is movable or whether it's immovable, such as a pole, a tree, or pedestrian. In this case, potentially, you can be a nuisance from that point of view and create what we call congestion, if you like, with potential of delinquents stepping in front of trucks or cars or automated vehicles, so to speak. It is a possibility, and this is exactly then where do we actually have this governance in terms of what do we determine to be safe, and how safe is safe, and where do we draw the line between obeying the roads, just like what we have currently in 2018 as we know it. We have traffic management system to allow the vehicle to operate as it is and for pedestrian to cross as safely as possible. But if we go into these cities where we have this mixed fleet, we have highly automated, fully automated, and we have people that may or may not have the traffic, what we call pedestrian crossing, and just take it for granted that a vehicle will stop for them. And this will become the dystopia that we're talking about, where there's all these issues that we could perceive.
I think it's a great segue now to our first opening sort of question. Who determines what safe is? What does that include? What's your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting because traditionally, we know that the industry, whether it be auto manufacturers or aerospace manufacturers or aerospace industry, or even the banking sectors, the government, were always trying to perceive some type of best practice. So from that point of view, they would then what they call regulate or have a best practice of legislative or guidelines. And if you look at it traditionally, how vehicles are driven, when it first started in the 1918s and 1940s and what have you, where there's motor vehicles, how it's been drawn up. Slowly, there's all these rules and regulations that comes in because of incidents. But if you look at the aerospace or banking, they start from the start in ensuring some safety concern from the aerospace, where the tolerance is very, very minute in terms of safety, in the sense that safety is first, is paramount. So from that point of view, the no fatalities point of view. So is it a 1 in 10 years or 5 in 100 years type ratio that we're looking at? So what determine what is safe, that is something for the industry and the legislators to come to some type of a discussion. But ultimately, we want to ensure that any connected automated vehicles, first and foremost, will reduce fatalities to zero, as what we're trying as the aspiration from that point of view.
Well, Catherine, do you think that's a fair assumption? Can we leave it to what Dixon said?
Yeah, I was really keen on jumping in there because it's not just going to be the legislators and regulators. The other element, as Daniel laid out, was the intuition that the public has. So if you look at how people have responded to deaths in driverless vehicles, there's been what we call a degree of outrage expressed. It's an overreaction, some might say, considering that the toll road for vehicles that are driven is so high, and we're not getting that kind of reaction. There is a science behind why there is a reaction when it comes to driverless vehicles, and that's because sitting underneath the outrage analysis are 12 key factors, and one of them is familiarity. We're familiar with driving a car, and so therefore we rate the level of risk associated with driving a car as much less than it really is. And because we're very unfamiliar with connected automated vehicles, we rate the risk being much higher than it actually is because we're very unfamiliar with it. So the reason why this is important is that if you just leave it to regulators and legislators, the reactive approach that happens in public policy is that people will respond to what they perceive as the risk as opposed to what they see as the hazard or the technical assessment. And therefore, we think there's a really good case to say we need a proactive approach at addressing the social license and outrage risks of connected automated vehicles early.
Wow. Anna, I've got a question here from Paul I'd like to direct to you. Why do we expect AVs to make split-second life or death decisions that we know to be completely unrealistic for human drivers? I think that's a great one, building on what just Catherine raised.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think the reason why we are so fascinated by AVs making split-second decisions is because they are actually making decisions, not reacting to split-second decisions or split-second scenarios. What lies behind that decision is a program that someone has put into the vehicle, and the vehicle is only doing what it's been asked to do. So I guess from an ethical perspective, we want to understand, well, what are some of those programming codes that have been written into the decision-making behavior of the AV? And I think that's where there is a really clear difference between what a driver might do in a car and then have to react very quickly to then what a AV will do in a situation, because it's probably likely that say, for instance, in that motorcycle scenario that I presented earlier, that the vehicle will have seen the motorcyclist 100 meters behind the vehicle, not only when it's in line of sight in front of the vehicle. And for ethicists, it's certainly really fascinating to play some of those scenarios to the nth degree to try and understand whether there will be some unintended consequences of having these programmers put in and input what the decision should be, or what the decision-making framework should be.
Fantastic. Dixon, do you have anything you want to add at all?
Yeah, well, I guess in terms of what Catherine's mentioned, I agree from that point that, we definitely need to ensure that the public is brought along this journey, as I think Daniel correctly and very, very in depth saying that, the perception of control. Because when you take away the control from the drivers or the public, that's the fear sets in. I got no longer the control or perception of control. So, I'm letting some machine learning interface doing all the decisions. So that's definitely something that I totally agree where, the public needs to be brought along on this journey and to reassure to the public that, what the system is doing or how they're doing it, this perception, it is correct. It's just like if we think back many, many years ago about how we've evolved from transaction, from banking, how we evolved from the fear of flying. That is the changes of the perception of people traveling or something when the new technology presents itself. That's always the challenges, and I think Daniel brought up a good point from that. And also just to add in terms of what Anna mentioned with that motorbike, what have you, we also need to look at some of the other industries where they have automated number of their robotics or warehousing or factories where a lot of the machineries are automated. When compared, if they would use physical or manual labor, the risk of injury to those people are much higher when in comparison to the automation. So again, that's the perception, that's the understanding of what, your original question, Jerome, what is determined to be a reasonable, safe outcome? What do we perceive that to be?
So is this sort of feature indicating if I carpool, I'm less likely for things to go pear-shaped? Is that what you're telling me?
Well, potentially. I mean, just like the good question, if you've got a school bus full of kids, when compared to a single occupant type driver. Then again, comes back down to what type of algorithms that you're writing into the codes, or what do we perceive to be ethically right perception. So
I'm going to come, when Glenn joins us, I'll come back on this one because I know he's got a bit of a devil's advocate one. But I think this is a great segue for the next one. Am I expected to carpool with strangers? How can I be sure my kids are not subjected to strangers? What risks have arisen? What's your thoughts, Daniel?
Well, so I think that's an interesting one, because I think it not only goes to this general safety theme, but it also goes to this one of fairness to an extent, because we can think about what circumstances have led you to feel like that was was that an option that was preferred, to have your kids in the car with strangers, and what else? What were my other mobility options when it came to that particular situation? So I suppose it's connected to that as well.
I've got Dixon nodding at me here. Dixon, you got something to add?
Yeah, I totally agree with Daniel, because if we look at the traditional transportation that we have, whether it be the buses, the minivans, and also you look at the use, whether it be the location that we're in. In metropolitan, say Melbourne, you have more accessible to the different modes of transport. Whereas you compare to, say, rural or regional, where you're quite limited by either the rural or regional train system or the bus system. So there might not be as much taxis or what have you in some of those regional areas. So it does come into play in terms of where you are in terms of from a location, but more so as well the cost of the travel from that perspective. So it does come into some sense in terms of do we perceive the exclusive use? So for example, if I don't want my kids to be sharing a ride with anyone else, currently right now I have a taxi, and then I just get a taxi from point A to point B and say, okay, that's what it is. And then but we also put kids in school buses or in buses, and they're traveling in with other strangers on a bus. So I guess this is the element again of what we are trying to say. What is the perceived acceptability with all this technology? Based on what we do know now, we need to understand, where is it that we're going.
Well, I guess, Adam, with your trials over in WA, what have you seen over there as an example?
Well, the trials has been going on since 2016, so we've got a really good data set of how people feel about AVs and relating to safety, and also the ride sharing aspect, given it's a Navier shuttle. So I think in terms of carpooling, I think that's limiting our imagination to what these vehicles could be by placing ordinary vehicles that we have today and then just making it automated, because there are lots of examples of when we do carpool in the shape of a bus and a train, and most of our public transport is shared. And so even with I think some of the things that we spoke about before about safety, it's really about then working backwards and saying, well, how can we make the technology or the shape of the vehicle to what we want it to be, and what is it that we truly want? So if it is that we want to reduce the number of vehicles on our roads, then it might mean that we do have to share the vehicle, whatever size that might be, with other people. And then the question that would follow is, how do we make that safer, or how do we make it safe for the occupants? And that could be done in a number of ways. It could be that we have video surveillance or audio surveillance, especially if we're having a lot of strangers in the same vehicle. But then that would flow into questions of whether we would need different privacy settings, because some of that, the conversations or visuals from that ride would be breaching personal privacy, for example. But the RAC IntelliBus trial has certainly been really encouraging to see the number of people who are excited about this transport option. And surprisingly, with our IntelliBus, it's the older generation that are more excited about this technology, because it's this sort of vehicle is likely to extend their years of independence than if they were just to rely on a driven vehicle, as an example.
Well, here's a great question from Athol. Which is a higher priority, saving the life of a person or avoiding delaying thousands on a motorway? This could result in a car launching itself off the edge of a motorway rather than causing a multi-vehicle crash that will close a motorway for multiple hours, resulting in significant societal costs. What's your thoughts on that one, Catherine?
The idea of the multi-vehicle crash, yeah? It really gets us into who's responsible for what, and that's why our view of artificial intelligence is that it's got to be less like a black box and more like a transparent decision-making process. So it's a bit crosses over a bit here into the applied ethics area that Rachel was talking about, because we want to know, well, on what basis have all those various decisions been made, and do we agree with them? I don't know if you've seen some of the most recent insights around AI, but there's been some demonstration, like say from Amazon, that they just couldn't stop it being discriminatory, and so they've had to trash one of their recruitment vehicles. And also, I've also heard that there's some views that in terms of how pricing is being done, people are thinking about doing it in a way that links to what people can afford, making decisions in ways that you might argue are unethical. So how does that relate to this? I guess it's a question of what does the black box actually need to contain in it in order to address all of these fears and concerns. And, our view, the more open we are about how those decisions are being made and what those decisions are, the better. Daniel and I were talking to a great academic yesterday who's doing an AI project. He was saying that in their trials where they're really trying to confront some of the ethics related to AI, they used a biometric meter and they looked at ways of assessing weirdness and psychology of humans. And they found just one of the most stunning things, which is people under 26 just accepted whatever the computer said about them, even though the coding was specifically designed to be confronting and difficult. It was accepted by people under 26 because the computer told them. So I think these raise all of these sort of challenges about, well, what as society do we want to accept and what will we accept, and how do we get people kind of in and engaged on this early? Because the more they understand it, the more I think our decisions will be more effective.
I guess it's a question like Fabian's pointing out here. Why do people think that a computer will make a worse decision than a human? What's your thoughts on that one? Does that sort of expand on what you were just talking about then, Catherine?
Yeah, sorry, I missed that, Jerome.
Why do people think that a computer will make a worse decision than a human?
Yeah, well, why do they? I mean, this is an interesting thing, isn't it? That it depends on, see, my intuition and value sets and filter and understanding might be different than Daniel's or yours. But at the moment, it's sort of quite randomized as to what a set of decisions will be in a particular split second. Whereas what we're talking about with artificial intelligence will be the norming of those decisions so that it is replicated many times. And so, it's not the luck of the draw anymore, it's actually the way things will be. So the question is, okay, well, what is the way we want things to be? And what values are there?
Oh, look, I'd sort of just go back to that notion that, generationally there are differences. And I was a software programmer a long time ago, and so I sort of understand a little bit how they sort of work under the hood. And I think people do trust that computers can make good decisions. So the question is, more do you trust, which decisions do you trust them to make with respect to critical issues. So if it gets into things like where I think that a computer, I suppose, is making decisions with respect to navigation, that's great. Do I trust the computer to make an ethical decision? No. And I will trust the computer implicitly on everything else that I think intuitively I sense that it ought to be able to make a decision. Now, I know that's a little bit of having it both ways, but it's understanding what people intuitively understand, and it is generationally affected, the capabilities of a computer to be.
Great, we're going to move on to the control theme now. We've got quite a few questions lining up for this section. So we'll just kick on first. What does control of cabs look like? And what is driver license going to look in the future? And basically, can people still drive? Anna.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think the first thing to really think about is, why do we have a license in the first place? And if we look at sort of the graduated driver's license and all of the aspects of the legislation that we have wrapped around the idea of identifying someone to say that you have passed X test so that you can get your license to drive, and you maintain your driver's license so that we can ensure that you're driving in a particular way, or in a way that's compliant with a set of rules that we've all agreed to socially under the Traffic Code or Traffic Act. And so what does a CAV look like, and is a driver's license still needed? Well, we might have something very different that might say someone is able to operate a vehicle. It might mean that the test that we sit to operate this vehicle might include questions about how to press a button, or how to troubleshoot the system if it needs troubleshooting. But it could also mean that my driver's license might be similar to, say, your Opal card or your Smart Ride, or whatever system that you have to say that you can get on and get off a particular mode of transport. The other reason why we do have a driver's license is so that we can be enforced and certain behaviours can be complied with. And so that's a very tricky one, because what do we do with driverless vehicles when it makes a wrong decision? Or how do we ensure that the driver or the operator in a vehicle, when the vehicle or the operator makes a bad decision, how do we ensure that we can justifiably punish someone through enforcement levels to say you are no longer able to operate a vehicle? And so what is the role of, say, police agencies to enforce certain rules on either the vehicle itself or the manufacturer or the operator? And I think those aspects are still very unknown, and is certainly likely to be quite a challenge.
I'd just like to add to what Anna just mentioned. I guess the other thing, Jerome, that we need to think about is, the operating environment. We've got, as we mentioned, we've got highways, we've got freeways, we've got urban roads, city roads, we've got laneways, etc. And the number of different modes of the transportation, as well as the different level of automation, if you like. I agree with what Anna's saying in terms of, there will be elements of that driver interaction, especially for the what we call the semi-automated or highly automated type vehicle, where there is still reliance on the driver as a fallback, if you like, whether it be on the urban or the freeway type roads. But then if we go into a city with pedestrian makes what we call pedestrian with the vulnerable road users, cyclists, etc., more than likely there may not be a driver per se. So that's where the manufacturer or the programming or the sensors and what have you needs to come into play. So different modes of vehicle will also operate at different environment as well. So the whole licensing needs to be reviewed in terms of, if I have a license currently, what it means for me in 10 years, what it means for me in 20 years, because currently we still have this mixed fleet as well over the next 20 years, where we're transitioning from a no automation or some automation to your highly automation as well. So this is the part where the education, the licensing needs to be holistic as well, and bring the public along again with education.
This is a great point here from Keith. He goes, will cabs be self-reporting to regulators and drivers to lose authority to drive without on-road enforcement? Do you think that'll happen?
Well, if all the data and all the information is recorded anyway, some of the trials that we know is happening, in 2017, 2018, where the system is sending out information. So if we have the full, the road regulation or the rule book implanted into the smarts of the computer of the automated vehicle, then any infringement and what have you, the computer will actually log it anyway. And that could be possible for the authority to know that vehicle A has got glitches or what have you. That is a possibility, but it's just a matter of what's the nth degree of this policing.
Well, and Harry, this goes a little bit further. Can we enforce a license system for cabs based on their learning as well?
Well, I guess it comes back down to what we're talking about with AI. I know that the ISO standard is looking at the artificial intelligence or machine learning in terms of what type of learning do we allow and what are parameters of that learning. And I think Daniel earlier mentioned on if we look at all the programming and what have you, computing is very logical. There's zeros and ones at the end of the day, and whatever algorithm you put in, they'll just go according to the logics of it. But AI has that self-learning, and it doesn't really have any emotion attached to it or feelings. So it's still based on what is being recorded and what is being perceived to be right from that point.
I was just wondering, Eddie asked. Sorry, go Daniel.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to reinforce that, Dixon. I think that's right. It adds to that sense that people trust computers because they know that, or they intuit that they're very independent creatures, right? They're not instinctively, they know that. But the question then, and this will come out in any question about bias and decision making, is the data that it's fed. Which raises a real question about the way that our data and our mobility data will be used.
Definitely.
I think just on that, Jerome, if I could just butt in. In terms of enforcement, I think it's really good to understand why we have enforcement in the first place. And that is to ensure that the behaviours of individuals who are all in control of their lives can be made compliant in some way, and so that everyone does a similar set of behaviours or displays a similar set of driving behaviours on the road. For example, if we're talking about the traffic code, I think one of the things about enforcement is there are consequences to your behaviour, and that consequence might be that you lose your licence, or you have to pay a fine, or you might have to spend some time in jail. And some of these things are, they're not, I guess, desirable consequences, which we use as a deterrent for breaking those laws. So if those things exist for people, and if AI is, as you say, is just a set of zeros and ones, then is that enforceable? Is that behaviour enforceable? And so if not the vehicle or the self-learning machine or AI is unable to be punished, then what else do we have? Is it the programmers? Is it the manufacturers? And I think that's the bigger challenge ahead of us.
Yeah, I agree.
Are we assuming though, and Colin makes an interesting one here, are we assuming that programmers will know all the scenarios? Dixon shakes his head.
Well, I'm just thinking from the number of years of driving and number of all the people out there that's driving, even professional drivers and what have you. There is the unexpected. So from that point of view, what happens when, and that's why the AI comes into play, right? Because the programmer will only write what it perceives, or the rulings or the codes that it knows, the traffic code. And then there is that intuitive learning that the AI will pick up based on certain learnings or certain faults that is picking up, and it learns from that. So at a moment when there is a critical point, if it's not within its database, let's call it, that's where it's trying to learn something, but at the same time, it may not make the right decision.
It's interesting. I might
go, Daniel.
Dixon. you know, I don't remember the manufacturer, and I'm not trying to plug anyone. They're talking about building the world's greatest driver, and in their artificial intelligence, you know, where there's all this effort to go into the one spot, so all the expertise and knowledge into one spot, and there's no question that at first a human will be far more effective, and over time, then you say, well, does every human encounter so many different scenarios? That meant no question those scenarios exist, but will we each encounter them, and will this world's best driver be better because it has been trained on all of those scenarios where it's impossible to train anyone to first, as it were. So there's an interesting question there, but obviously with my social license hat on, I'd be thinking about what would it take for people to believe that and trust it.
And this is a great question that Collins has tabled here. There is a lot of commentary in this webinar about changing public perception or understanding why is this necessary? Is this indicating a weakness in the technology? Catherine, what's your thoughts?
Well, let me just rephrase it. So you're saying, why do people?
Why is there a weakness in the technology? Does it reflect a weakness in the technology? Or this concern about computer decision making?
Well, I mean, it's an evolution, isn't it? Like we've had biases in our decision making, direct and indirect discrimination. You know, some of them are programmed into our amygdala. You know, it's right. The primitive brain has done that. You know, so for instance, we have at our very core, the human primitive reaction of fight, flight, or freeze, and that's based on the tribal reaction to threat. So that then flows through into how we make decisions, and people like Malcolm Gladwell have written, you know, the book Blink, that to say, and even in modern society, we're making split-second decisions intuitively that are often wrong about these, you know, biases and filters. So when we have and sit coders down in front of a screen, they're taking forward some of their unconscious biases into how they frame up decisions, and that's what one of the major concerns that we have around how ethics are going to be both taken into account, but also how the values of society evolve over time, which is they do change. You know, today we don't have the same views about racial differences as we did, you know, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and one assumes that will keep on evolving, but AI and computer tech decision making mightn't.
So what I would say as well, building on that, Catherine, is the name of the game really for me, what a lot of this comes down to is we have trouble accepting that a computer can make these decisions because it will essentially be, we think that it's making them on our behalf, because we can't agree on what decisions should be made with each other. At a very personal level, I don't necessarily feel comfortable driving with some other people that I'm in the car with sometimes, and some people don't feel comfortable driving with me. We know that we handle different situations very differently, and what we're talking about is codifying a set of rules for all of us that we all agree with. And that just logically boggles the mind, as it were. How's that possible? Yeah. So I think that's part of the psychology of what we're up against.
Yeah, and it is just distinctively a challenge, not just because there's trust factors there, which is, you know, do I trust that your set of decisions would be the same as mine? Assuming, of course, that my set of decisions, and people always make this assumption, my set of decisions are better than yours, which actually factually might be incorrect.
And what I'll do now is I'll move on to our next question, because there's a lot of questions bubbling away around here about data. What is my mobility data being used for? Does the government know my travel behaviour? Is my data available, or is it being sold, or do I get a return? And one other angle I'll draw into is Ahmed asked one here. How can an AV know the life story of people it encounters, e.g. the kid or the old lady? But Daniel,
I think Anna
Catherine,
mentioned that.
you guys.
Yeah, well, I was just saying, I think Anna mentioned, just taking that second part first, Anna mentioned that with the connected aspect, and with the speed of networks and even data stores, whatever it might be, and computing, that it can potentially determine that in real time, if there is such a thing as real-time computing. But in terms of data, I think we might use your utopian scenario, because we haven't taken those out for a spin in the discussion as much as we probably could. So the dystopian, I mean, if you would, I won't use the dystopian one, because I think we've seen enough evidence of some dystopian data scenarios coming out of politics and other situations to know that this could go very badly. So in a utopian view, would be saying, well, if I think about my data, and let's say pick 3 tranches of data. There's data that relates to services that I would call protected areas of public life. So things that relate to me as allowing me to have, fair access to things. I would say in a utopian world in whatever it was, 2032, we've got that right. We've caught up.
This is interesting.
Yeah, I think we've got
put us on hold.
That was the utopian music. And then the second, oh, there it is again. But then there's a second tranche of data, and this is, in the future we could say, well, we've let people decide what they want to trade, what data they want to trade for services, for pricing. We do it now a little bit, but Catherine mentioned a little while ago the idea that you can have different pricing. You can be sold to along the way. You could be in these, sometimes people refer to these things as moving rooms, where you can be advertised to, and you're okay with that because you've entered into that transaction transparently for whatever reason. You may not love it, but you understand the deal. The third one, which I think will still be debated, there's a category that will still continuously be debated, and that is greater good versus individual benefit. And these are using your data and other people's data for the general decision-making system for the greater good. And I think that debate will rage on, as it always has.
A minute or breathing into a speaker there.
Oh, I'm all good here. Got a question here from Phil. How would the ethical question of either audio or visual information being monitored be answered? How would the public perception of Big Brother situation be answered?
Well, I can answer that one. That's a really great question, and something that privacy advocates, particularly in ethics and philosophy, have long discussed. And you won't be surprised that these discussions tend to bubble up as soon as there's a new technology that's available that might better sort of track or listen in or know what you're doing before you've, I guess, explicitly given that consent. I guess in the 50s, one of the first things that the privacy advocates were calling against was for trackers that were being used to track people on parole. And they said that this would be violating personal privacy rights. And so it's interesting, again, then sort of in present day, where we all have smartphones, that where multiple vendors and suppliers might be tracking our movements and even listening in on occasions. And there's certainly been a number of stories where that's certainly come to light, where the government, or government as in, the big G, and other organisations or other phone companies might be listening in. You might have a phone conversation about flowers, and then you get a marketing an ad saying, buy flowers today. So it's certainly been around for a long time, but I think at the centre of it, the principle for privacy is that I, as a autonomous or someone with autonomy, has the right to tell you about me or access to me, and it's really up to me to give you that consent. And so that's why things like, someone reading my private diary might be seen as a personal private breach, because I haven't given you that explicit consent to read it. And I think that plays out slightly differently in sort of legislation where things like the Privacy Act might not cover those personal privacy breaches, but it might cover someone using my identity to go and do things like defraud me, or use my identity or use my access to me to go and do things without my consent. So in terms of CAVs, where I would be in a vehicle where we have audio and visual surveillance, this is something that we'll need individuals to explicitly consent to, because the flip side is that I might want this so that I can ensure security of my own safety when ride sharing with others. This becomes even trickier when I've consented to a Google Home and then a Google Car, and a private company like Google with might have full access to me 24/7. You know, I might have an app that gauges how I sleep, and so it will be 24 hours a day. I think this is certainly a conversation that society has to have about the level of surveillance that we're sort of being, I guess, being forced on us or implicitly consented to. And this is really where we have to think about how much do we want external people to know about us, implicitly and explicitly, and how much do we agree to?
And I think I got a good question here from Belinda, which just teases out a little bit further. Will the ethics and logics, and I'll draw in data to it as well, change for different countries depending on the local values? Or will there be a standard international programming? So what happens when you move around the place? Dixon, you're shaking your head at me.
Yeah, I guess, you know, it comes down to what each of those countries have in terms of what Anna just mentioned about the privacy law and what have you. I know in Europe and Australia, where we have very strong, what they call legislative instruments against those data or the privacy of those data. It does depend, in as far as I understand, because again, you know, the data that we have, you know, just like in taking in a taxi, you know, for security purposes to protect the taxi drivers or what have you, you know, it doesn't ask for a consent, so to speak, to say, you know, you've been recorded and your audio may be used in court if something happens. It's just displayed as a statement. When when you're in Japan or what have you, and then you know, in some of the other countries when you're in trains, you know, it's 24/7 live feed. So I guess it depends on what we use that data for and how stringent those legislation might be. And I know Anna may challenge me on this, but I'm just taking more from a generalist point of view that, you know, we've got when it comes to CAV as well, you've got vehicle data, you've got the journeys data. You've got your interaction data between vehicle and the infrastructure or vehicle to vehicle. And then on top of that layer, you've got your actual physical type data information or your cyber type data. And then what are those could be private or public. You know, just like, again, Anna mentioned about, you know, our mobile phone. You know, because every one of us carrying a mobile phone and have a mobile signal, it enables us to know what are some of the congestion or what's the pooling of density for certain area based on our GPS location. So it depends on what type of services we're looking at. And I'm one of those that, you know, definitely says, you know, if it comes to private data, privacy is privacy. But what is the line that we draw to say, well, if it's for the better good of emergency services or for you know, critical security or what have you, then, you know, it's not a matter of asking, it's a matter of then a statement to say that, you know, you are being recorded, this is for your own safety or something, you know. And country to country could be different.
Great. What I'm going to do now is move on to the fairness. We've got 15 minutes left, and I must say we have lots and lots of questions, so I'm sort of trying to bounce through them and feed this in. So next question in fairness, which is our last sort of theme, feasibility of CAVs for those who may have mobility challenges, the elderly, disabilities, and the young. Daniel, would you like to kick off talking around how we can overcome these sort of barriers?
I mean, this is often put forward as a real opportunity, isn't it? Mobility opportunity. So it's, if we're thinking about it as a barrier, then I suppose it's an economic barrier we're talking about in some respects. So how did we overcome an economic barrier for those that potentially need the service most? And I think, you know, so Finland made Wi-Fi a human right, didn't they? In their human rights charter. So there's a potential there for a way of thinking about what are expected services, and this goes to the evolution of public transport, So in the utopian society, potentially it's not even a question people would understand, because they would consider that to be a human right. Now, that's a bit of a, well, going to the utopian scenario, I'm not sure it answers the question, but this is a real opportunity, and I almost don't like to think of it as a barrier.
That's a good point, though. Does it have to become? Do we have to wait for it to become a human right for everyone to get access to it, or will it be something that's purely for those who can afford it? Is that the barrier?
Yeah, I was talking to a city councillor about connected automated vehicles the other day, and his view was that they should be banned from being privately owned, because it would be a breach of human rights to allow them to be privately owned and not demand that they are shared vehicles that for everyone's good. So I think that different value sets here apply, don't they, around the purpose of them. Like if you're thinking about designing a solution, you normally say, well, what are you trying to design the solution for? What was the problem that you are trying to solve? And so I like the idea that we have, multiple ethical overlays, whether it's human rights and social justice and environment, whether it's about mobility and, increasing accessibility, whether it's about traffic flow and timeliness. Everyone's going to have a sort of multiple sets of criteria around how they think decisions should be made, but we can come to some consensus as a community, and then we can keep on evolving that consensus over time when we evaluate how things are going against it. That fundamentally, in our view, is how you achieve a social license in this situation.
They're great points.
If I can jump into them, I think CAVs have, as Daniel said, some really great potential to even out some of the challenges that specific minority groups or other groups with, say, disability or socioeconomic disadvantages might really be able to take advantage of this and equal out some of that playing field. I think some of the things really to think about here are, what will these CAVs look like to make sure that we can ensure that these vehicles provide that fair solution or provide a solution that will equalise that playing field? And just as an example, Commonwealth Bank, I think a little while ago, have been under scrutiny because some of their touch screens and some of the things that they've put out there as ways for people to do online banking or whatever it is, it's discriminatory towards people that have vision impairment because it's a flat screen and none of those tactile braille solutions are actually on the screen. So it's certainly it's a good reminder to say, well, what if we do want these CAVs to be a solution that everyone can use and that 100% of the population can use, then what does the technology have to look like to ensure that it can provide that fair playing field?
That's a great point. And
very good point.
And I'm just going to flip it a little bit further. Will people get more fat from CAVs? So will that become a health barrier to bringing them up? What's your thoughts? Anyone want to start on that one? Okay, Dixon, Anna, what's your thoughts?
Well, it's certainly been raised a number of times particularly about last mile solutions, because people will be walking less, and people that catch public transport are more likely to get more exercise because they're having to walk that last mile. So it's a really great question. And I think, is it a solution that we have treadmills in driverless vehicles going forward? And it's certainly something to think about. I think the technology is there for us to make what we want of it. And we can almost think of it as a blank slate. What do we want for society? And what are some of those really good outcomes? And what are the right things to do? And then work backwards and make the technology suit what we would like.
I think Paul's made a couple of good statements around those things. What sort of creative business solutions can the private sector come up with? And I think that's a great sort of segue, because I know over in Singapore, as an example, if you walk, you can get mobility bonuses, so you can actually use more of their private public transport system. So maybe that's an option. So I guess the question is, how do we introduce a new mobility pricing model for CAVs? How do you make this fair for everyone? how does this impact the socially disadvantaged? Catherine, would you like to kick off on that one?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I guess the first question I'd ask is, what is fair? I mean, at the moment we have an economic system that says if you can afford it and pay for it, that is fair. We have a toll road system that charges a multi-millionaire the same price as somebody on the dole, and that is at the moment perceived as fair. So that's what the regulations, legislation says, and that's what the business model is based on. So the concept of fair has lots of different descriptions, but the one we use in risk communication is, does society come to the conclusion that the trade-off between the rewards and the risks are the appropriate ones? And you can take lots of different frames. So my sense of fair, in terms of if we were taking a human rights lens, is that fair is that you reduce the risks of not enabling accessibility. So fair is enhanced mobility. And I think there's some antecedents that demonstrate that that's where we as a society want things to go. For instance, I don't know if you remember the activist group Penny, but they fought very hard for disabled people to get access to public transport, which is why over time we've now had those platforms so that you can, people in wheelchairs or blind people or people who've got prams, other things, can actually get on at the same level. That was an accessibility and mobility anti-discrimination court case that was fought and won based on fairness just being perceived as something that everyone should be able to access. But as it relates to business, we haven't necessarily come to that conclusion, which is what is fair for the automotive industry or others to provide, and on what basis, for who, when. So yet another element that I think is really important for us as a society to think through. Just in terms of sustainability, it would be fairer in our minds for there to be no postcode poverty, and postcode poverty happens at the outskirts of our cities where trams and trains stop and there isn't infrastructure available to them. So if we really wanted to make things fair for them, maybe it's enabling them to have connected automated vehicles, or somehow enabling them to live at the centre of our cities, with better, more affordable housing and reduced costs associated with mobility. But I think these are things that we need to talk about as a community. I'm keen on knowing what the panel thinks.
Anna, have you got some comments?
About fair pricing, well, I think Catherine's right. What do we mean by fair, and is it fair that everyone has to pay the same fee regardless of your economic status? And this is certainly something that I think it was Sweden or one of those Northern European countries which are socially fair, in that someone's had to pay, a fine that's 100 times more than the average person because their earning capacity is much greater. And this sort of comes back to, what does fairness look like, and does where you live make a difference in terms of country? And just to go on that point, the fairness in Europe or in Western Europe would be very different to fairness in America, because their political ideologies are so different. And if we look at some of the ethical frameworks that they've said must be legislated in AVs, in Europe they've talked about greater safety for all, whereas in America they've talked about promoting individual mobility for everyone as different levels of what they would like. In terms of how much everyone needs to pay, I think that will, that's a really tricky one, and we can't get road pricing right or road user pricing right at the moment, let alone trying to get a fair mobility price for cabs. So yeah, challenge.
If you want to touch on that, we did actually do a pricing webinar previously.
Yes.
I think it's number 3. But I'm also very mindful that we're over time and we're coming to the end of it. And I do apologise for those questions that I was unable to get to. So in closing, I'm going to work through our panellists and say, what are the key barriers we need to overcome for cabs to be mainstream in Australia by 2032? Dixon, I'll start with you.
From my point of view, we need to really make it a holistic approach from the industry, the public, the government. From the industry, we're looking at all the technologists, all the suppliers, all the OEMs or manufacturers. The public, of course, the people, and the government in terms of all the legislative concerns that they may have or they want to put in. But also to look at it from the holistic point of view of transport mobility. So we're not only looking at vehicles, whether it be bus, shuttles, trains, trams, but the other type of mobility. We touched on briefly about accessibility to the elderly and what have you. So, if we can get the first responders to them, such as drones and what have you, that is part of the transport mobility solution. So I believe that we need to ensure that with all this new technology, we also need to have some type of standard testing of the technology in order for us to have a assurance, what we touched on earlier on about safety.
Great answer from an engineer. Automotive one, I should say. Anna, what's your thoughts?
I think in closing, I think this is such a great opportunity. Computers and automated vehicles, which are really computers on wheels, where we are now, we have an opportunity to take a proactive approach to programming and a proactive approach to working out what that future will look like. And I think, it was great that you played those clips or you showed those clips of those movies. It doesn't have to be like that. And we can certainly all contribute to what that future will look like. I think if we can try and resolve some of these challenges and agree to what this future, what we want this future to look like, then we can certainly have this paradisical sort of view of, transport and mobility where it is fair, where it is safe. And it's just really about having that discussion about what are some of these things that we would like.
Right, and we have the ADVI Summit come up in 2 weeks, so we can sort of feed some of these questions and barriers in. Daniel, would you like to give us your thoughts, please?
I might be cheeky and sort of repurpose the word connected in connected automated vehicles and think about the thing to overcome would be how do we connect people to those vehicles themselves in terms of reflecting the way that they think about the way decisions should be made, or their acceptance that there's a common way that should apply to the way that decisions are made on their behalf. So how do we connect society into the way that decisions are made so that they're comfortable and understand and feel that the vehicle can represent them?
That's a very powerful way to sort of finish this off. That's great. Catherine.
Yeah, I like that too. I think it's about transparency as well, transparency of those decisions, so we feel connected, we understand them, and we also are able to evaluate them. I mean, I think if you look at the way social license is struck, essentially it's struck based on the right balance at that time for society, taking into account all that they've known and all that they think they know for the future. But as we trial new types of technologies, we should also have a model that allows us to kind of feed back in and say, gee, we thought that these sets of decisions would create this outcome, but there's a whole bunch of unintended consequences that we hadn't predicted. So let's take those into account, feed them into the system, work out what the right balance is for the future, and make the adjustments, not just in an artificially intelligent way, but make the adjustments in a human, connected, and transparent way that aligns us to better and better outcomes from the technology that should be serving us as a community.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Catherine. So now we're going to look at winding up. Thank you very much to our panelists, to Anna Sawyer, Dixon Lowe, Catherine Tay, Daniel Abbas, and unfortunately, I think the aeroplane has delayed poor Glenn, so we unfortunately missed out on his input. And thank you very much to our audience for today. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
And now I will shut this down. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.